This paper proposes a methodical approach for establishing a site museum on the contested World Heritage Site of Pasargadae under the rubric of place. The basis for this proposed approach is that, as a contested site, Pasargadae is imagined differently by various groups or collectives. It is a multiple place. Who are these groups, and how do they mutually inform and transform one another, and how does this influence the conceptions of Pasargadae as place? How stable are these groups, and what are their commonalities and differences? In other words, how many renditions of Pasargadae as place exist which the museum needs to assemble or engage with? The multiplicity of Pasargadae is rooted in its long history that is compounded by contending political, economic, and representational discourses, which operate upon the site at a range of scales, from local to national and even global, as World Heritage. Furthermore, the political contestations of the site can cause immediate existential threats. Could the museum negotiate the multiplicity of this place? A report in 2004 suggested that the site was suffering from a general disintegration caused, amongst other things, by state-level political divisions, conflicts of interest between locals, non-locals, and authorities, physical and natural erosion, and shortage of infrastructure and facilities. Disintegration could partly mitigate if different groups of users identify with the site and its museum, making the latter a medium for connection, a kind of representational social adhesive. The task of a site museum from this perspective is, arguably, to allow the assemblage of different facets of Pasargadae and thus to play an active role in representing concurrent and equally valid constructions of place. This is not limited to a concern for interpretative flexibility, which stops at deconstruction, and is distinct from a single meta-narrative voice that suppresses difference. Rather, it is an acknowledgement of the existence of concurrent social realities and the facilitation of their construction. It is about perspectival meta-narratives. After a brief introduction of the site of Pasargadae, I will introduce a theoretical approach which brings together divergent aspects of Pasargadae under the rubric of place. I will provide examples of Pasargadae's transpositions and possible candidates for groups or collectives that play a role in interpreting sites such as this one. This will highlight areas of further research that, if developed, contribute to establishing a meaningful and inclusive museum. Pasargadae is located approximately 90 kilometers northeast of the city of Shiraz, the capital of the province of Fars in south of Iran. It is within the Morghab Plain, an area of 20 kilometers by 15 kilometers approximately, with diverse geographical features comprising mountain passes, riverbeds, agricultural and dry land, permanent villages, and archaeological sites, and annual nomadic encampment and migration routes. Pasargadae is adjacent to an ancient highway that connected Shiraz and Isfahan. This is going from north to south and was in use until the 1950s. The site is the location of the first royal residence planned and built by Cyrus the Great after he founded the Achaemenid Empire. Pasargadae began as a sacred district and an administrative and ceremonial capital for Cyrus and his successors, and retained its relative administrative significance until the 14th century. Its original function is unknown, and it could have been used for succession, investiture ceremonies, or as religious training center. Cyrus envisaged Pasargadae as a series of geometrical gardens known as Paradise Garden, containing a series of monument pavilions. Chief among them is his iconic tomb. Originally, this tomb would have been located within a paradise garden, but is now surrounded by arid land. Architecturally, the tomb is a hybrid of Mesopotamian and traditional Iranian tomb house typologies. Such hybridity or eclecticism, which is also apparent in other structures on this site, amounts to a political statement by Cyrus designating the extent and uniqueness of his empire for visiting subjects. The tomb was in the Islamic period transformed into a mosque and this has turned it into a palimpsest featuring the remains of a prayer niche upon which the Victory Surah of Quran is inscribed. The gardens of Pasargadae were delineated by decorative watercourses. They would become the archetype for all later Achaemenid gardens and inform the concept of the Islamic garden as we know it today. The idea of a royal landscape design follows a trajectory of landscaping as political statement dating before 900 BCE. Cyrus's innovation, however, was in the geometric planning of the gardens and the association between watercourses, the cultivated areas, and the pavilions. Pasargadae exemplifies the eclectic and innovative nature of early Persian architecture and landscape design. Some of its innovations would continue to inform the architectural culture of the region for the next 2,500 years. Today, Pasargadae is designated as World Heritage, in accordance with the first 4 criteria designed by UNESCO, mainly for its archaeological values. The current understanding and interpretation, which is predominantly archaeological, often ignores other important aspects that relate to the site's life, such as its socio-political milieu. Perhaps it is in reaction to such a distortion that the site's management report emphasizes, and I quote, the cultural value of the site, by introducing it as a cultural landscape, and identifies a number of areas, chiefly cultural tourism and social development, for future focus. The terminology of cultural landscape or cultural value are vague and say little about the current and changing relationship between different groups, such as local residents and tourists, through this site. Pasargadae has constituted a multiplicity of places throughout its history. In the 20th century, it has become a site of national origin, and the Tomb of Cyrus has become an emblem for national political debates and an allegory for the construction and contestation of sanctioned versions of collective identity. This can potentially expose the site to neglect, or worse, to political or even physical violence. The problem is thus concrete and immediate as follows. It is about engendering senses of identification and belonging among different groups of users and quote-unquote stakeholders, which should underpin the conceptions of Pasargadae and its museum, if they are to last, of course. The question is, therefore, what are the different figurations of Pasargadae to which a museum should respond? How can the museum negotiate the different imaginations of Pasargadae as place? This proposition, which is understanding the museum as the mediator of the multiple aspects of Pasargadae, pertains to 2 interrelated questions. Firstly, what is place? And secondly, who is imagining its various connotations, i.e., who are the actors? I am positing place from a collective perspective, as the outcome of a process of associating identities with sites, in this instance the heritage site of Pasargadae. This process, which I thoroughly explore in my other writings, may be identified as inscription, and relies on imaginations of a given site. The collective here signifies groups of individuals assembled through the common grounds consisting of cultural practices, social and political inclinations, or economic status. Place is conceived once a site or locale is imagined through 4 components, namely textual references, performative actions, spatial interventions, and political colligations. Textual references are citations, whether written or oral, through which the locale is described, imagined, and remembered. Performative actions designate human presence and movement within a locale, be it a religious or civil ritual or the annual migration of nomads, or else, as in this case, the almost ritualized movements of visitors and tourists upon a site. Spatial interventions designate any addition, transformation, or restriction that results in a spatial change or a change in the perception of space. These may include constructing a structure, such as this museum, or more subtle acts, such as determining paths for visitor movement. Finally, political colligations suggests the deliberate appropriation of a site for an ideological narrative as its symbol or emblem, such that, the sanctioned version subsumes all other existing narratives upon the site. It is therefore totalizing. Together, these four elements form a collective imagination that transforms the site into different places. In this sense, place is relational and determined by other connections, including those to other sites outside the locale. Furthermore, place has an inherent aesthetic aspect. It is perceived through the senses. This model of conceiving place can help identify the multiplicity of Pasargadae and acknowledge the different layers of history and experience that underpin it as a cultural landscape. An overview of the transpositions of Pasargadae over the past few centuries clarifies the operation of different collective imaginations upon this site and the multiplicity of places arising from that process. I will now describe some of these transpositions throughout the site's history. After the fall of the Achaemenids at the hand of Alexander, Pasargadae gradually fell into oblivion. It took until the 19th century for Western travelers and explorers to make the connection between the tomb, then buried under a layer of appellations and other historical functions, and Cyrus the Great. During that period of oblivion, the tomb was designated as the martyrium of the Mother of Solomon, and was considered sacred and a place of feminine pilgrimage. The tomb, and by extension the site, would have been cloaked in a sacred aura and religious stories and citations emerging from it, which is textual references. As such, the place was a pilgrimage site, which included performative actions, and as an administrative center, it combined political and religious signification. In 1223, the tomb was transformed into a congregational mosque, also known as a Jama mosque, built of materials spoliated from the ruins of palaces in its vicinity. This was spatial intervention upon the site, reinforced by the inscription of Quranic verses in the interior wall of Cyrus's tomb. Almost a century later, that is between 1355 and 1374, and in close proximity to the tomb, an Islamic school or caravanserai was established for pilgrims and possibly religious education purposes. The site was decisively Islamicized, although not necessarily ideologically colligated, and its memory as a sacred Islamic place would linger until the present. The Achaemenid origin of the site was identified gradually and through recognition of its structures, specifically the Tomb of Cyrus, by Grotefend in 1818. It was only in 1908 that the German-American archaeologist Ernst Hirschfeld conclusively supported the ascription of the site to Cyrus the Great. This revealed the Islamic layer as an afterlife of the Achaemenid site. In the course of the next few decades, the site would become the focus of archaeological attention and state ideological projections. In mid-20th century, in a nationalist milieu, the site would be politically colligated. Ali Sami, a former director of Pasargadae, described the structures of the Islamic period as ugly and unsightly work of graceless and inexpert builders. He endeavored to restore the supposedly pure Persian architectural and artistic qualities of Pasargadae before any admixture and association with other countries, and this was an ideological statement not supported by scientific archaeological evidence. Sami undertook the first plant preservation measure in 1955. This was the construction of a stone platform around the structure of the Tomb of Cyrus within a 1.8 meter high wall. The wall enclosed an area surrounding the tomb such that the view to the tomb remained unobscured. This was a definitive attempt to historicize an otherwise living religious monument. The appearance of the perimeter wall and the other protective measures constitute a spatial intervention. As a result, the customary religious traditions and their associated rituals would have ceased, which transposed the site, the place, by changing its performative aspect from ritual to tourism. Such transformations were apparently undertaken independently of state political intentions, but existing and future state politics would render them otherwise. After its conception, Pasargadae was the origin of a network of royal Achaemenid sites.